The colony on Verath 7 sat at the edge of known space like a forgotten outpost that nobody wanted, but everybody watched closely. And the humans who lived there had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, because that was the price of being allowed to exist among the stars. 5 years had passed since humanity signed the Deathworlder Integration Accords, a treaty that sounded generous on paper, but in practice meant that humans were kept in walled-off quarters on every joint colony, monitored like dangerous animals in a zoo, and reminded daily that the galaxy considered them barely civilized creatures from a brutal world. Verath 7 was no different, and the human quarter was surrounded by reinforced walls that the Galactic Council called safety barriers, but every human knew were really just the edges of a cage. Lena Vasquez was 8 years old, and she did not care about any of that. She cared about her drawings, about the colored pencils her mother had sent from Earth, and about the funny-looking alien merchants in the trade district who always made surprised clicking sounds when she showed them her pictures. Her father was Commander Tyrus Vasquez, a retired Marine who now spent his days fixing water recyclers and power conduits for the colony. And he had taught Lena 2 things above all else: be kind to everyone, and never let anyone see you afraid. Lena had taken both lessons to heart, which was why she walked through the trade district every afternoon with her sketchbook under her arm, and a smile on her face that made even the grumpiest Valori shopkeeper pause for a moment before remembering to scowl. Her favorite person in the whole district was a Torvathi merchant named Relos Tan, a small amphibian-like alien with enormous golden eyes and a voice like water running over smooth stones. And she had spent the last 3 weeks working on a portrait of him and his family that she planned to give him as surprise. Today was the day she would finally deliver it. She slipped out of the human quarter through the east gate, where old Sergeant Mwangi always waved her through with a wink and a reminder to be back before the evening bell. And she walked with her drawing held carefully against her chest, so the wind would not bend the corners. The trade district was alive with movement and noise, and the strange sweet smells of alien food stalls, and the hum of translation devices that turned 100 different languages into something everyone could understand. Lena loved it here, because it was the one place on the colony where walls did not matter, and everyone was just trying to sell something, or buy something, or eat something, and nobody had time to be afraid of a little girl from a death world. But today something was different. There were soldiers everywhere, tall avian reptilian Valori in gleaming black armor, carrying shock batons on their hips. Through the market, in tight formations, with their heads swiveling like predatory birds, scanning for prey. Lena did not know that 3 days ago, a new compliance officer had arrived on Verath 7, a sub-prefect named Elira Dorashan, who had been sent by the Valori High Command with specific orders to tighten control over the human population. She did not know that Elira had already imposed new curfews and confiscated educational tablets from human children, and ordered random inspections of human homes at all hours of the night. She did not know that Elira believed with every fiber of her being that humans were dangerous beasts pretending to be civilized, and that the Council was making a catastrophic mistake by allowing them to live among proper species. All Lena knew was that there were a lot of new soldiers, and they looked mean, and she should probably walk quickly and deliver her drawing and get home before anyone bothered her. She was 3 streets away from Relos Tan's shop when a sharp voice cut through the market noise like a blade. "Human, stop where you are." Lena froze and turned around slowly, and she had to tilt her head way back to look up at the Valori officer standing over her, because Elira Dorashan was nearly 8 feet tall, with iridescent black feathers, and eyes like chips of orange glass, and a mouth full of teeth that were not designed for smiling. "You are outside the designated human zone," Elira said, and her translator made her voice sound flat and cold, like metals scraping against stone. State your identification and purpose. Lena swallowed hard, but she did not cry, and she did not run, because her father had taught her that running from predators only made them chase you. My name is Lena Vasquez, she said, in a voice that only shook a little. I am going to see my friend Relos Tan to give him a present. She held up the drawing. Alira looked at it, the way someone might look at a piece of garbage stuck to their boot. Human juveniles are not permitted in the trade district without an authorized escort, Alira said, and she stepped closer, and Lena noticed that the other aliens in the market were backing away, pulling their children close, pressing themselves against the walls of their stalls. I did not know about that rule, Lena said. I come here every day and nobody told me. Ignorance is not a defense, Alira said, especially not for your kind. She reached for the drawing, and Lena pulled it back against her chest because it had taken her 3 weeks, and she had worked so hard on the shading around Relos Tan's eyes, and she was not going to let this mean bird lady take it. And Alira saw a small human refusing to submit. She saw a Deathworlder displaying defiance. She saw what her training and her prejudice and her fear told her to see. A threat. The shock baton came off her hip in one fluid motion, and she brought it down across the child's body with the same force she would use on an adult criminal resisting arrest. The crack of the discharge echoed through the market like a gunshot. Lena was thrown sideways, and she hit the ground hard, and the drawing flew from her hands and landed face down in the dust. And her left arm bent at an angle that arms were never supposed to bend, and her whole body convulsed as the electrical charge ripped through her small frame. She did not scream. She tried to, but her muscles had locked up, and all that came out was a thin whistling sound that was somehow worse than any scream could have been. Relos Tan came running from his shop 3 streets away because he had heard the discharge, and he found Lena on the ground shaking, and he dropped to his knees beside her and looked up at Alira with his enormous golden eyes filled with a horror that transcended species. She is a child, he whispered. She is just a child. Holstered her baton and looked down at the small broken body at her feet, with no more emotion than if she had stepped on an insect. She is a Deathworlder, she said, and she will learn her place. Then she turned and walked away, while her soldiers followed in perfect formation, and not one of them looked back. 20 minutes later, Commander Tyrus Vasquez received a frantic comm call from Relos Tan, and he listened without saying a word, and when the call ended, he stood very still for a very long time. Then he walked to the door of his quarters and opened it, and looked out at the human quarter, where families were eating dinner, and children were playing, and people were living their small quiet lives in their small quiet cage. And every human who saw his face stopped what they were doing, because they knew that expression. They had seen it before on the faces of fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters throughout all of human history. That something terrible had happened, and something more terrible was coming. Within the hour, the human quarter of Veraf 7 went completely silent. No voices, no music, no laughter, no sound at all. And 3,000 aliens on the other side of the walls felt a chill run through their bodies that none of them could explain, because silence was just the absence of sound, and there was no logical reason for it to feel like a predator crouching in tall grass, waiting. The medical bay in the human quarter was small and clean and smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. And Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood over Lena Vasquez with steady hands and a fury burning behind her eyes that could have melted through the hull of a starship. The child was unconscious, and her left arm was broken in 2 places, and there were branching electrical burn patterns across her torso that looked like frozen lightning, and her small body twitched every few seconds as residual charge worked its way through her nervous system. Dr. Tanaka had treated combat injuries before, back when she served as a field surgeon during the Proxima conflict, and she had seen grown soldiers brought down by shock batons designed for crowd control. But those were military-grade weapons calibrated for adult bodies with adult nervous systems and adult pain thresholds. Using one on a child was not just excessive force, it was something that did not have a word in most galactic languages because most species could not imagine doing it. She set the bone carefully and applied a regeneration cast and treated the neural burns with a precision that came from years of training. And while she worked, she dictated every single injury into her medical recorder, with the cold clinical detail of someone who knew that this report would eventually be read by people who needed to understand exactly what had been done. Patient is an 8-year-old human female, she said, presenting with a compound fracture of the left radius, hairline fracture of the left ulna, second-degree electrical burns consistent with a GPA standard shock baton discharge at full power, neural disruption across the central and peripheral nervous systems, and extensive soft tissue bruising to the left side of the body. She paused and took a breath. The weapon used is rated for adult Valori males weighing approximately 300 kilograms. The patient weighs 26 kilograms. The force applied was therefore approximately 11 times the maximum safe threshold for her body mass and age. Commander Tyrus Vasquez stood in the doorway and watched his daughter breathe, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change what had happened, and words were not going to fix this. He walked to the bed and leaned down and pressed his lips against Lena's forehead very gently, and her skin was too warm from the electrical burns, and she smelled like ozone and medicine. And for one moment, his composure cracked, and his hands trembled, and something raw and terrible moved across his face. Then it was gone. He straightened up and walked out of the medical bay, and the door closed behind him, and Dr. Tanaka noticed that he had not asked a single question about Lena's condition, which meant he already knew what he needed to know. She was alive, she was hurt, and someone was responsible. Outside, Sergeant Major Kira Okafor. She was a tall woman with dark skin and close-cropped silver hair, and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and she had served 30 years in the Human Systems Alliance Marines before retiring to this quiet colony posting that was supposed to be her reward for a lifetime of service. She had been given the nickname Forge early in her career, because her commanding officer said she was like a blacksmith's forge, quiet on the outside, but hot enough inside to reshape metal. And the name had followed her across 2 decades and 7 combat deployments, and she had never once complained about it. Within 30 minutes of the incident, she had locked down every entrance to the human quarter, not with barriers or weapons, but with calm, quiet people standing at every gate, who smiled politely at any alien who approached, and said, "The human quarter is closed for a community meeting. We apologize for the inconvenience." Because there was indeed a community meeting happening in the central plaza of the human quarter, where every adult human on Veroth 7 had gathered without being asked. 412 people stood in neat rows in the fading light, and not one of them spoke. Because every single one of them had served at least one tour in the Systems Alliance military. That was a requirement of the colonial posting, a fact that the Galactic Council knew, but had somehow failed to understand the significance of. And every single one of them recognized what was happening. This was not a crisis. This was an activation. Okafor stood on the steps of the community hall and looked out at them, and she did not need to raise her voice, because the silence was so complete that a whisper would have carried to the back rows. A GPA officer struck Lena Vasquez with a shock baton in the trade district 2 hours ago, she said. Lena is alive and receiving medical treatment. Arm is broken and she has electrical burns, but Dr. Tanaka expects a full recovery. Nobody moved, but the silence changed somehow. The way the air changes before a thunderstorm, when everything becomes heavy and charged and waiting. Ambassador Relos Kian has been attempting to reach the GPA command to file a formal protest on our behalf, Okafor continued. He has been blocked by Sub-Prefect Ilira's troops. They are citing security protocols and refusing him access. Still, nobody spoke. The Galactic Council Regional Authority has received both our report and Sub-Prefect Ilira's report. Ilira has claimed that Lena displayed aggressive posturing, and that force was justified under GPA Protocol 7, Hostile Species Containment. A ripple went through the crowd, not of sound, but of something else. Something that an observer might have described as 400 people simultaneously arriving at the same conclusion. The Council has sided with Ilira provisionally and has ordered us to submit to an increased security presence in the human quarter for our own protection. Okafor reached into her pocket and pulled out the Council's official ruling, and she read it aloud, every word in the same calm, measured tone she might use to read a grocery list. And when she was finished, she folded the document carefully and put it back in her pocket. I will be making some calls to Earth, she said, and that was all. The crowd dispersed without a word, each person returning to their quarters with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had just received orders, because they had, even though no orders had been spoken out loud. Okafor went to the communications room in the basement of the community hall, where the colony's long-range quantum relay was housed, and she sat down at the console and entered a series of codes that she had memorized 20 years ago and had hoped she would never need to use. A priority black channel, the highest classification in the Human Systems Alliance military communication system, reserved for situations involving immediate threats to human civilian populations in alien territory. She composed the transmission carefully. First, she attached Dr. Tanaka's complete medical report with every photograph and scan and measurement. Then she attached the colony's surveillance footage, which showed in perfect clarity a Valori officer 3 times the size of a human child, bringing a shock baton down on that child's body, while the child held a drawing against her chest. Then she added a single line of text in old military shorthand, a code phrase that had existed since before humanity reached the stars, since before they even left their own continent, a phrase that every human soldier in history would have recognized. One of ours, a child, requesting resolution. She encrypted the transmission and sent it, and then she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes and waited. The signal traveled at faster-than-light speeds across the vast emptiness between stars, bouncing through relay stations and quantum nodes, crossing sectors and systems and the invisible borders between civilizations. It reached Earth in 11 minutes. It reached the desk of Admiral Helena Cross at Systems Alliance Naval Command in 11 minutes and 14 seconds. It reached the bridge of the HSA Dreadnought Thermopylae in 11 minutes and 31 seconds, where Admiral Konstantin Petrov was sitting in his command chair, reviewing routine patrol reports and drinking coffee that his aide had made too strong again. Petrov read the transmission once, then he read it again. Then he set down his coffee and pressed the ship-wide communication button. And when he spoke, his voice was as flat and featureless as a frozen lake. All hands, this is the Admiral. Set Condition 1 throughout the fleet. Are changing course to the Verath system. This is not a drill. The Thermopylae was the largest warship humanity had ever built. A mountain of armor and weapons that the Galactic Council had specifically asked humanity to keep in the inner systems where it would not frighten anyone. And when its engines fired at full power, the ship vibrated with a deep harmonic rumble that the crew felt in their teeth. 46 other ships changed course with it. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet, the most powerful concentration of human military force outside the Sol system, turned as one and aimed itself at a small colony on the edge of known space, where a little girl with a broken arm was sleeping in a medical bay, still holding the crumpled remains of a drawing she had made for a friend. and across the galaxy, in the quiet cold of space, something that had been sleeping began to wake up, the kind of something that the Galactic Council had built, the Deathworlder integration. Accords specifically to prevent, the kind of something that had no name in any alien language, but that every human knew by instinct. A feeling as old as the species itself, as old as the first parent who picked up a rock to defend a child from a predator in the dark. It was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was not hatred, though hatred lived somewhere in its shadow. It was something simpler and more terrible than either of those things. It was the absolute certainty, shared by every human being alive, that there were lines that could not be crossed, and that the penalty for crossing them was not negotiable. And someone had just crossed one. 3 days passed on Verith 7, and the humans did nothing. This was the part that frightened the aliens more than anything else. The Valori garrison had expected rage, had expected protests, had expected the kind of violent outburst that would justify a full military lockdown and prove to the galaxy that humans were exactly the dangerous animals the Valori had always said they were. Instead, they got compliance. Perfect, absolute, mechanical compliance. When the Valori soldiers conducted their security sweeps through the human quarter, every door opened before they could knock, and every human stood with their hands visible, and their faces calm, and their voices polite, and they answered every question with yes, sir, or no, sir, or I understand, sir, and nothing else. There were no arguments, no complaints, no resistance of any kind, and every single Valori soldier who walked through those corridors came back to the garrison with the same report, the same uneasy look in their eyes. They are not afraid, a young Valori corporal told his commanding officer. I do not understand. We took their children's learning devices. We searched their homes at midnight. We put their child in a medical bed, and they are not afraid. They look at us the way one looks at something that is already dead, but does not know it yet. The commanding officer told him to stop being dramatic and get back to his patrol. Sub-Prefect Ilira Dorashan spent those 3 days in her office, reviewing reports and writing recommendations for even stricter controls on the human population. And she was in an excellent mood, because the council had supported her ruling, and the humans had submitted, just as she had predicted. Ambassador Relos Kien visited her on the second day and tried once more to warn her. You do not understand what you have done, the small Torvathi diplomat said, his golden eyes wide with a genuine terror, that Ilira found amusing. I have studied humans for 40 years. I have read their history, their literature, their military records, and I am telling you that this silence is not submission. Then what is it? Ilira asked, with the patient condescension of someone who believed they already knew the answer. It is patience, Relos said, the most dangerous kind of patience, the kind that comes before a response so overwhelming that it reshapes the political landscape of an entire region. You struck a child, Sub-Prefect, and you recorded it in your own logs as justified force, and you have given them something they have never had before in the Council's territory. And what is that? Moral authority, Relos said, and then he left, because he could see that Ilira was not listening, and there was nothing more he could do. On the morning of the 4th day, the long-range sensor station at the edge of the Varath system detected a series of faster-than-light signatures emerging from subspace, and the technician on duty stared at his screen for several seconds before calling his supervisor, because the readings did not make any sense. How many ships? The supervisor asked. 47, the technician said. The supervisor looked at the readings, and his face changed color in a way that was not healthy for his species. What flag? He whispered. Human Systems Alliance, 4th Expeditionary Fleet. The lead ship is... The technician paused and checked his database. The HSA Thermopylae, a Titan-class dreadnought, commanded by Admiral Konstantin Petrov. The supervisor sat down very slowly. He had heard of Petrov. Everyone in the regional military command had heard of Petrov, because the Galactic Council had a file on him that was 700 pages long, and the executive summary on the first page contained a single recommendation printed in red text: do not provoke. The system, in a formation that military analysts would later describe as textbook human intimidation doctrine, which meant that the ships were arranged so that no matter which direction you looked from the colony, you could see at least a dozen warships hanging in the void like iron mountains. Human warships did not look like the ships of other species. They were not elegant or streamlined or beautiful. They were built by a species that had evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill them, a world with crushing gravity and violent weather and predators around every corner. And their ships reflected that origin. They were thick and heavy and covered in layers of armor that other species considered absurdly excessive. And they carried weapon systems that were designed not just to defeat an enemy, but to make the very concept of being their enemy feel like a terrible life choice. The Valori Regional Command scrambled every patrol ship they had, and the total came to 14 vessels, which was a respectable force by most standards, but which looked like a handful of insects next to the human fleet. Admiral Petrov did not contact the Valori. He did not contact the colony. He did not contact anyone at all for 6 full hours, which was a move of psychological warfare so elegant that military academies across the galaxy would study it for decades. He simply sat there, in his command chair on the bridge of the Thermopylae, drinking coffee and reading reports, and occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound journal that his daughter had given him for his birthday, and he let the silence do the work. Because Petrov understood something that most alien commanders did not understand about humans, that the waiting was always worse than the action, and that an enemy who did not know what you were going to do was already half defeated. At the 6-hour mark, he finally spoke. "Communications," he said. "Open a channel to the Galactic Council Regional Headquarters on Station Anuarkesh. All frequencies, no encryption. I want everyone in this system and the 3 nearest systems to hear this." His communications officer opened the channel. "This is Admiral Konstantin Petrov of the Human Systems Alliance 4th Expeditionary Fleet," he said, and his voice carried across every frequency and every relay and every receiver in the sector, with the calm weight of a man who had never in his life made a threat he was not prepared to carry out. 3 days ago, a Galactic Peacekeeping Authority officer under your jurisdiction used a military-grade weapon on a human child. An 8-year-old girl named Lena Vasquez, who weighs 26 kilograms and was carrying a drawing she had made for a friend. He paused and let that settle. We have the surveillance footage. We have the medical records. We have the testimony of 12 alien witnesses, including a Torvathi merchant who is a registered citizen of the Council. Another pause. We are not here to negotiate. We are not here to file protests or submit to arbitration or participate in your review processes. We are here to collect. On Station Anuarkesh, the Council representatives were gathered around a broadcast screen, and several of them had stopped breathing. You have 12 standard hours to deliver Sub-Prefect Alira Dorashan to the custody of the Human Systems Alliance for trial under human law for the crime of aggravated assault on a human minor. If she is not delivered within that time, we will come and get her ourselves. And I want to be very clear about what that means." He leaned forward slightly. "It means that every ship you see on your sensors right now will move from where they are to where she is, and nothing in between will slow us down. And when we arrive, we will take her and we will leave. And if anyone attempts to stop us, they will not succeed, and that is not a prediction. It is a mathematical certainty." He sat back. Petrov out. The channel closed. On Verat 7, in the human quarter, Sergeant Major Okafor heard the broadcast on the colony's receiver, and she allowed herself a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes. On Station Anuarkesh, the Council erupted into chaos. The Valori ambassador was screaming about acts of war and treaty violations, and the sacred authority of the Peacekeeping Authority. and the Torvathi delegation was quietly passing around copies of the surveillance footage. And the Rathani collective's representatives were making rapid clicking sounds with their mandibles that their translators rendered as, "We told you this would happen." And in her office on Verath 7, Sub-Prefect Elira Dorashan stood at her viewport and looked up at the sky where she could not see the human fleet, but where she knew it was waiting. And she felt something cold move through her body. Something her species had not evolved to feel, because her species had never had a predator above them on the food chain. It took her a moment to identify the emotion. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that lived in the bones. The kind that her ancestors had never needed, because they had always been the strongest thing in the room. But they were not the strongest thing in this room. Not anymore. And the clock had started counting down. The Galactic Council's emergency chamber on Station Anwar Kesh was a vast circular room designed to hold representatives of over 300 species in comfort and dignity. And right now it held 47 delegations who were shouting at each other with the kind of panicked fury that only comes when powerful beings suddenly realize they are not in control. The Valori High Ambassador, a towering creature named Dorath Kale, whose ceremonial armor was covered in medals from campaigns against species too weak to fight back, stood at the central podium and demanded that the full military might of the Council be mobilized against the human fleet. "This is an act of war," he declared, his voice booming through the translation systems in every language simultaneously. "A Deathworlder fleet threatening a Council installation. This is exactly what we warned you about when you signed those foolish accords. And now you see the truth of what these creatures are." Torvathi Ambassador, a tiny figure named Selish Mora, who barely reached the podium's lowest microphone, waited for the shouting to die down, and then spoke in a voice so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear. The sub-prefect used a weapon rated for 300-kilogram adults on a 26-kilogram child. She said, "I move that we watch the footage before we decide who the aggressor is." The footage played on every screen in the chamber. It showed a little girl holding a drawing, looking up at an officer 11 times her mass. And then it showed that officer strike her with enough electrical force to drop a full-grown soldier. And it showed the child hitting the ground and convulsing, while the officer walked away without a backward glance. When the footage ended, the chamber was quiet for a long time. The Valori ambassador called it regrettable, but within operational parameters. 14 delegations walked out of the chamber in. On Verath 7, 10 hours remained on the clock, and the colony existed in a state of suspended animation, where everyone was waiting, and nobody knew what they were waiting for. In the human medical bay, Lena Vasquez opened her eyes. Her father was sitting beside her bed, in a chair that was too small for him, and he was holding her uninjured hand. When she looked at him with her big brown eyes still cloudy with pain medication, he smiled at her in a way that used every muscle at his face to hide what was happening behind it. "Daddy," she said, "am I in trouble for going to the market?" Tyrus Vasquez felt something break inside his chest that would never fully heal. "No, baby," he said, "you are not in trouble. You did nothing wrong." "The bird lady took my drawing," Lena said, and her lower lip trembled. "I worked really hard on it." "I know you did. I heard him calling my name, but then everything got fuzzy." "He is fine. He is the one who helped you. He carried you to the gate himself." Lena was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Daddy, why did she hurt me?" And Tyrus Vasquez, a man who had fought in 3 campaigns and held the line at Proxima Colony, and earned a silver star for carrying 2 wounded soldiers through enemy fire for 6 kilometers, could not answer his daughter's question, because there was no answer that an 8-year-old would understand. And the real answer, because you are human and she is afraid of what that means, was not something he was willing to put on a child. "Some people do bad things," he said finally, "and when they do, Other people make sure it does not happen again. What kind of people? Our kind. 6 hours remained. On the Thermopylae, Admiral Petrov stood in the ship's wardroom, looking at a holographic display of the Verath system, and his senior staff stood around the table, waiting for orders. Captain Adaize Obi, the fleet's chief legal officer, had prepared 2 files, one for a diplomatic resolution and one for a military extraction, and both were sitting on the table in front of the admiral. "The council is still deliberating," she said. "The Valori are pushing for a unified military response, but they are losing support. The footage is circulating on every public information network in the sector, and public opinion is shifting rapidly." "How rapidly?" Petrov asked. "The Rathani Collective has publicly stated that they will not participate in any action against the human fleet. The Torvathi are actively advocating for compliance with our demands. The Kralith Dominion has recalled its ambassador from the Valori homeworld, which is unprecedented. And 17 independent colony worlds have issued statements condemning the attack on the child." Petrov nodded. "Fleet? 2 additional battle groups are en route from the Valori inner systems. Estimated arrival in 9 hours, which puts them here 3 hours after our deadline. Even with the reinforcements, their combined firepower is approximately 31% of ours. So they are stalling. That is our assessment, yes." Petrov was quiet for a moment, and then he did something that surprised his staff. He asked his communications officer to open a narrow band channel to the colony's human quarter, and he asked to be connected to the medical bay. Dr. Tanaka answered, and there was a brief exchange, and then a small, sleepy voice came on the line. "Hello?" Lena said. "Hello, Lena," Petrov said, and his voice was different now, softer, like a grandfather talking to a grandchild. "My name is Konstantin, and I am a friend of your father's. I heard you had a rough day." "I got hurt," Lena said, "but Dr. Tanaka fixed me up, and my dad says I was brave." "Your dad is right. I also heard you are quite the artist. I like to draw. I was making a picture for my friend, but the bird lady took it." "Well, I think your friend knows you made it for him, and I think that matters more than whether he has the paper. But listen, a lot of people are working very hard right now to make sure you are safe, okay?" "Okay. And I need you to keep being brave for a little while longer. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good. That is all we ever ask." The channel closed, and Petrov stood for a moment with his hand resting on the communications console, and nobody on the bridge said a word. Then he straightened up, and his face became granite again. "If they do not comply in 6 hours," he said, "we go in. Prep the Marines." On Station Anuarkesh, the final hours were chaos wrapped in desperation, wrapped in the slow dawning realization that the Galactic Council had created a situation that had no good outcomes. The Valori High Command refused to surrender at Aelira because doing so would mean admitting that a Valori officer could be wrong. And their entire cultural identity was built on the belief that the Valori were always right. But the other species were cracking. Behind closed doors, ambassadors who had never spoken to each other were having urgent whispered conversations, and the word that kept coming up was not humans, or fleet, or war. The word was precedent. Because if the council let a GPA officer attack a child and face no consequences, then no child of any species was safe. And every delegation was thinking about their own children, on their own colonies, where the Valori GPA patrolled with shock batons on their hips. The Rathani Collective was the first to break ranks publicly. Their lead ambassador, a massive insectoid creature with iridescent wings and a voice like wind chimes, stood in the chamber and made a statement that would be quoted in history books for centuries. 22 years ago, the humans came to our world and freed our people from the Krethian hegemony, she said. They asked nothing in return. They bled for us and they asked nothing. And now they ask only that we protect their children the way they protected ours. And you want me to say no? She cast her vote for compliance. 3 more delegations followed immediately. The final vote was close. 114 for compliance, 111 against, with 22 abstentions. And the margin was thin enough that the Valori ambassador screamed that it was illegitimate and stormed out of the chamber. But the vote stood. Sub-Prefect Elira Dorashan received the order on a formal council document sealed with the authority of the regional governance body, commanding her to surrender herself to the custody of the Human Systems Alliance within 1 standard hour. Times. Then she looked out her viewport at the Valori patrol ships that were supposed to protect her. Small, bright dots against the darkness, and beyond them, barely visible but undeniably present, the human fleet, massive and dark and patient. She reached for her sidearm, not because she intended to fight her way out. Even Elira was not that delusional, but because a Valori officer was taught that surrender was worse than death, and she had spent her entire career believing that she was superior to every other creature in the galaxy, and the idea of submitting to judgment by Deathworlders was more than her pride could bear. Her hand closed around the weapon, and then her office door opened, and Sergeant Major Kira Okafor stepped through it. Okafor moved through the doorway, like water flowing through a crack in a wall, smooth and unhurried and inevitable. And behind her came 4 HSA Marines in full combat armor, who spread out across the room with the silent precision of people who had rehearsed this exact kind of entry 1,000 times. Elira's hand was still on her sidearm. Okafor looked at the weapon, and then looked at Elira's eyes. And she did not draw her own weapon, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not make any sudden movements. She simply stood there and waited. And in that moment Elira understood something that all the intelligence briefings and threat assessments and xenopsychology reports had never been able to communicate. That the most terrifying thing about humans was not their strength, or their endurance, or their ships, or their weapons. It was their patience. They would wait as long as it took. They would stand in front of a loaded weapon with empty hands. And wait. Because they knew with absolute certainty how this was going to end, and rushing it would only make a mess. Elira's fingers tightened on the sidearm, and then loosened, and then tightened again, and the seconds stretched like wire being pulled thin. Sub-Prefect, Okafor said, and her voice was quiet and even, and almost kind. We both know how this ends. The only question is whether you walk out of here or get carried. And I would prefer it if you walked, because I think there has been enough violence on this colony already. Elira looked at the Marines flanking the room, and she saw their faces through their open visors, and she expected to see hatred, or anger, or the savage bloodlust that the Valori propaganda networks always attributed to Deathworlders. Instead, she saw nothing. Just calm, steady eyes watching her, the way a mountain watches a storm, knowing that the storm will pass, and the mountain will still be there. Her hand fell away from the sidearm. Okafor stepped forward and removed the weapon from its holster, with a movement so fast that the security cameras in the room would later show it as a blur between 2 frames. And then she placed restraints on Elira's wrists and guided her toward the door with a hand on her elbow that was firm but not rough. You are being taken into custody under Joint Council and Human Systems Alliance authority, Okafor said. You will be treated according to the conventions of both jurisdictions, and you will be given full legal representation. Elira said nothing. She walked through the corridors of her own garrison with her head down and her wrists bound, past rows of Valori soldiers who pressed themselves against the walls to let the humans pass. And not one of them moved to intervene, because they had seen the fleet on their sensors, and they had read the history files, and they knew what the humans had done at Proxima and at Kareth Station, and at the siege of the 12 Gates, and none of them were willing to die for an officer who had beaten a child. The shuttle ride to the Thermopylae was silent. Admiral Petrov met them in the hangar bay, and he looked at Elira for a long moment. She looked back at him, and she searched his face for the cruelty and savagery that she had always believed defined the Deathworlder species. She found nothing but a deep and terrible tiredness, the kind that comes from fighting the same battles over and over again, against people who refuse to see you as anything other than a monster. "Take her to the brig," Petrov said. "Full accommodations. She is a prisoner, not an animal, and we will demonstrate the difference." 2 weeks later, the trial began. It did not take place on a human ship or a human world, because Admiral Petrov had made a decision that changed the course of galactic politics. He demanded that Aelira be tried before the full Galactic Council, in open session, with the proceedings broadcast to every member world and colony and station in the galaxy. The Valori protested. The Council's legal advisors warned that it would set a dangerous precedent. Petrov did not care. "I want them to see," he told Captain Obi as she prepared her case files. "Every species on every world, I want them to see what was done, and I want them to see how we respond to it. Because this is not just about one officer and one child. This is about what kind of galaxy we're going to live in." The trial lasted 4 days. Captain Adaizi Obi served as the human prosecutor, and she was a woman of average height, with short natural hair and dark eyes that held a quiet intensity. And she presented the case with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She presented the surveillance footage frame by frame, and the chamber watched in silence as Aelira's shock baton came down on Linus. Small body. She presented Dr. Tanaka's medical report with holographic displays of the injuries. The fractures mapped in red against the outline of a child's skeleton. The neural burn patterns spreading across the torso like the roots of a poison tree. She brought in witnesses. The Torvathi merchant Relos Tan, who described how he had found Lena on the ground, shaking, and had picked her up in his arms and run to the human quarter because she was so light, so impossibly light for a creature from a death world, and how she had still been clutching the crumpled remains of a drawing in her unbroken hand. "What was the drawing?" Captain Obi asked. "It was a portrait," Relos Tan said, and his voice wavered with emotion, "of me and my family. She had been working on it for weeks. She told me she wanted to get the shading right around my eyes, because she said I had kind eyes." The chamber was so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support systems sounded like thunder. Captain Obi turned to the assembled council, and she asked a single question that would be engraved on the memorial plaque in the Hall of Records. "If this is how your peacekeeping authority treats a child holding a piece of art, then what piece are you keeping?" No one answered. The defense argued operational protocols and threat assessments and the inherent danger of Deathworlder physiology. And every argument dissolved like smoke in the wind, because there was no protocol in any military on any world that justified what the footage showed. Aelira was found guilty on all counts: aggravated assault on a minor, abuse of authority, filing a false official report, and conduct unbecoming a peacekeeping officer. She was stripped of her rank, her service record was voided, and she was sentenced to 15 years in a council rehabilitation facility under joint oversight. But the trial was not the end. Beginning, Admiral Petrov requested the floor for a final statement, and the council granted it because at this point refusing him anything seemed unwise. And he stood at the central podium in his dress uniform, with his hands clasped behind his back, and he spoke to 300 species and billions of beings across the galaxy. He did not threaten. He did not boast. He did not even raise his voice. "Humanity has endured your restrictions," he said. "Your surveillance, your quarantine zones, your walls, and your fear. We have been patient because we understand that we are new here and we are different, and we know that different can be frightening." He paused. "But hear me clearly, there is no law in this galaxy, no fleet, no alliance, and no power that will protect anyone who harms our children. This is not a negotiation. This is not a warning. This is not a policy that can be amended or repealed. This is simply what we are. Around the chamber, at hundreds of alien faces staring back at him. We did not come to your stars to conquer. We came because we looked up at the night sky and wondered what was there. We came because that is what humans do. We reach for things. We explore. We build. We connect. We brought our children with us because a future without children in it is not a future worth building. His voice dropped lower. So you can fear us if you must. You can call us Deathworlders and build walls around our homes and monitor our movements and write reports about how dangerous we are. But know this, the same thing that makes us dangerous is the thing that makes us love our children with a ferocity that your translators do not have a word for. And the day you understand that is the day you will stop being afraid of us and start being grateful that we are here. He stepped back from the podium. That is all I have to say. The chamber was silent for 11 seconds, which in the context of a Galactic Council session was an eternity. Then the Rathani ambassador began to click her mandibles together in a slow rhythmic pattern that the translation systems identified as the Rathani expression of deepest respect. And one by one, other delegations joined in with their own species equivalent. The Torvathi humming low harmonic tones, the Kraliths stamping their lower limbs, the Seleuci flashing bioluminescent patterns across their skin, until the chamber was filled with a sound that had never been heard before in the history of the council. A sound made up of 300 different voices saying the same thing in 300 different ways. We hear you. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed. The Valori GPA contingent was removed from Vareth 7 and replaced with a joint peacekeeping force that included human personnel for the first time in the history of the Accords. Were renegotiated from the ground up, and the new version did not include the words containment or restricted zone or compliance monitoring. The walls around the human quarter on Vareth 7 came down on a bright Tuesday morning, and Lena Vasquez watched from her father's shoulders as the last section was removed, and she cheered and waved her cast-covered arm in the air, while Relos Tan stood beside them, making the Torvathi sound that meant pure joy. The crumpled drawing, the portrait of Relos Tan and his family that Lena had been carrying when Illyra struck her, was recovered from the trade district where it had fallen in the dust, and it was carefully restored and placed in a frame and hung in the Galactic Council's Hall of Records, in the section reserved for artifacts of historical significance. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Let this remind us what was nearly destroyed and what rose to protect it." And on the bridge of the HSA Thermopylae, 4th Expeditionary Fleet prepared to return to its patrol route, Admiral Petrov found a package on his command chair, wrapped in colorful paper, with a note that read, "Dear Mr. Constantine, thank you for helping. Love, Lena." Inside was a drawing. It showed a grumpy-looking man with a big chin and bushy eyebrows, sitting in a chair surrounded by stars. And the proportions were wrong, and the perspective was off, and the stars were too big, and it was without question the most beautiful thing Konstantin Petrov had ever seen in his life. He had it mounted on the bridge bulkhead next to the main view screen, in a frame that his chief engineer built from spare hull plating. When his officers asked about it, he said nothing. But the crew of the Thermopylae would later swear, every single one of them, that on the day that drawing went up on the wall, they saw Admiral Konstantin, the Hanner Petrov, do something that none of them had ever seen him do before. Smiled.